On the day of the equinox, daytime and nighttime are of approximate equal duration all over the planet. We know when the equinox has arrived when the day and night are equal lengths. The nominal aim is to ensure that the first day of the festival of Passover, falls on the first moon after the vernal equinox, following the biblical rule, observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover unto Yahweh your Elohim. In Psalms 19:6, it says, his going forth is from the end of the heaven, and his circuit unto the ends of it, and there is nothing hid from the heat thereof. So we're talking about the sun's cycle, its circuit. And so again, I reemphasize the word tekufah means a revolution of the sun in its circuit. And so the sun's circuit comes to an end. So we have the two seasons that are mentioned in the Bible. When the sun reaches the equator, the length of the night and the day become equal. So when we express this with the Latin word equinox, meaning equal night, this occurrence is known as a tekufah, the Hebrew word for equinox, the point at which a circuit comes to a close. When winter ends for the northern hemisphere, it is because the sun is directly over the equator. There are 26 weeks of summer, which we would call spring and summer, and 26 weeks of winter, which we would call fall and winter. The Karaite calendar uses only the Abib to indicate when the new year is. In order for them to declare the first month, they must find Abib barley prior to the new moon of what is either the 13th or the first month. This is typically either the new moon prior to or after the vernal equinox. They do not consider the vernal equinox a sign. So the equinox or the Abib will help determine when the beginning of months start. Is it the equinox or is it the Abib? Or can it be both? So the new moon of the first month will happen after equinox and is witnessed by the Abib, the agricultural state of barley. And this is defined as the seed maturity of the barley harvest. So there are 3 times a year that we have a harvest. We have the barley harvest in the spring, the wheat harvest in the summer, and the fruit trees in the fall time. And all those are centered around the time that all the men were required to go up to Jerusalem 3 times a year. So the annual calendar is set by the alignment of both the monthly lunar cycle and the annual solar cycle. The lunar cycle sets the seasons based upon the solar cycle that is found in the equinox. The moon and sun together are governing signs. God's sacred year begins with the month of Abib or Nisan. And we see that in Exodus chapter 12 and Deuteronomy chapter 16. Abib, the first month of the ancient Hebrew calendar corresponding to the month of Nisan. In Deuteronomy 16:1 it says, observe the month of Abib and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought thee forth out of Egypt by night. The Hebrew word here actually reads observe, meaning watch for or guard. So we observe the month of Abib. In other words, to be looking for the new moon where the Abib can be found. Because harvests are governed by the seasons, which are controlled by the movements of the heavenly bodies, the maturity of the barley crop in Israel will coincide with these calculations and is a necessary factor for establishing the new year so that there is the required grain to be offered at first fruits. So we must have the equinox first, and then we must have the Abib, because we need the barley harvest to offer up at the Feast of First Fruits. Feast of First Fruits is not going to be far behind the behind Passover and Feast of Unleavened Bread. So we've got to have the Abib to be able to give the first fruit offering. The Abib is a second witness for knowing when the first month has arrived. It is important to use the sun, moon, and stars as the first and calculable witness, and then watch as the second witness of the earthly agricultural signs confirm the heavens. So our first witness of the appointed times would be the moon, the stars, the sun, and then the second witness would be the earthly form of the barley harvest. It is important to use the sun, moon, and stars as the first incalculable witness, and then watch as the second witness of the heavenly agricultural signs confirm the heavens. So when we look at Exodus 13, so when we look at Exodus 12:2, we see that it says, "This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month to you." So we know that this is the month of Abib. And it goes on in Exodus 13:4 to say, "This day came you out in the month of Abib." So we know that the Exodus of the Israelites happened in the month of Abib. It happened after Passover. It happened during the time of unleavened bread. It happened during the time of the Feast of First Fruits. It happened during the month of Abib. So if we're going to apply that to what is more commonly referred to, we would refer it to the month of Nisan, even though that is a Babylonian name. It's also referred to as the first month. And in Exodus 34:18, it says, "The feast of unleavened bread you shall keep. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread, as I commanded you in the time of the month of Abib. For in the month of Abib you came out of Egypt." And in Deuteronomy 16:1, we have another witness to this feast. It says, "Observe the month of Abib, and keep the Passover unto the Lord thy God. For in the month of Abib the Lord thy God brought you out of Egypt by night." I read you these verses to show you that the first month cannot even occur unless there is an Abib, the ripening of the barley harvest. So we have to use that as a witness. We cannot go by just looking at counting the months according to the moon cycles, but it has to happen after the equinox, and it has to happen when the barley harvest is Abib. If the barley is Aviv at this time, then the following new moon is Hodesh Habib, which means the new month of the new Abib. So what is Abib? Abib indicates a stage in the development of the barley crops. The basic meaning of the word Abib is the stage in the growth of the grain in which the seeds have reached full size and are filling with starch, but have not dried yet. So Passover happens at the first full moon after the spring equinox. One complete cycle of the solar year takes 365 days. In each year, there are 4 special days: the longest day, the shortest day, and the 2 days where day and night are of equal length. Those are the equinoxes. The Hebrew word Abib actually translates as the season of spring. So Abib is not the name of the month, but rather one of the 4 seasons. Abib accordingly also means spring, one of the 4 seasons. Are the months determined by the barley being Abib or the moon, or is it both? The moon and the barley are actually witnesses to one another. So when we're looking at the beginning of months, it says in Exodus 12:2, "This shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first of months of the year to you." Which year are we talking about? It is the religious year, the religious calendar. And so we look at, as we've looked at before, Hodesh from H2318 in Strong's means the new month, by implication, a moon, okay? And Rosh, so Kodesh is a new month or new moon. Rosh means the head, or it can mean new. And so when we look in here in Exodus 12:2, the word year is Shana, as in the year, Hashanah. That is a revolution of time. So the feasts are scheduled unto us to keep the appointed time. In Leviticus 23:1-3, let's read that. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, Concerning the feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. This weekly feast that we're talking about right here is the weekly Shabbat. It is separated, as you can see, from the rest of the feasts. The weekly Sabbath is the only day that Yahweh rested on. But there are other feasts in the annual feast that he causes us to rest on and to do no work. So Leviticus 23:4-6, it continues on to say, These are the feasts of Yahweh, even holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. So if you notice here, it starts off in the first Moedim outside of Shabbat. It says, in the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. It doesn't say it's a feast, but it's really a meal. But then we get on to the first feast here. It says on the 15th day of the same month, we're still talking about the first month, it is the feast of unleavened bread. That is a Moedim, and it is also a feast, a Hag. So we look here at a chart here of how the feast months work. We have the equivalent on the left of the Jewish month. In the middle we have how it corresponds to a Gregorian month and what the feast is. So the first one we have here, the first three Moedim we have happen in the month of Nisan. And that can happen in March or April, depending on how the moon operates in relationship to the equinox. So the first feast we would have, or the first Moedim rather, would be Passover, and then we would have the Feast of First Fruits, we have unleavened bread. They're all happening very quick, right, one after another. And then we count 50 days, the Omer count. We count 50 days between the Feast of First Fruits, and then we get to the fourth feast of Shavuot, and that happens in the Jewish month of Sivan, and that can happen in May or June. And so that is the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. And then we have this pause for the feasts, and we go to the 7th month of Tishrei, and that happens in September and October. And though we have the final feasts of Yom Teruah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot. And then there's a part of Sukkot which is its own little feast by itself, that is called Shemini Atzeret, or the 8th day. Because we live in two different worlds, one in the Hebrew world, which consists of Yahweh's calendar, and a civil world, which consists of a Gregorian calendar, we have to find out what the conversion is between the two calendars of the Gregorian calendar and the Hebrew calendar, or Yahweh's calendar, because that we want to keep the feast days of Yahweh. We often find ourselves first seeing what does Yahweh's calendar consist of, what dates does it point to, and now how can we convert that in the world that we live in, which is amongst the civil world, which uses primarily a Gregorian calendar. So in using a calendar, we have to define what a calendar is. So a calendar is a system of organizing days for social, religious, commercial, or administrative purposes. This is done by giving names to periods of time, typically days, weeks, months, and years. So in Yahweh's calendar, this keeping of days, weeks, months, and years is done differently in the Gregorian calendar. The Gregorian calendar is a solar-only calendar, meaning that this calendar is based solely on the heliocentric idea of the Earth revolving around the sun. So if you're going to go by the Gregorian calendar, it is a calendar kept only by the sun. The Gregorian calendar is the calendar that is used mostly in the world. So if you have a calendar in your house or at work or in your school or whatever, you'll find that it is a typical calendar that you buy at your local store, and that is called a Gregorian calendar. And it's called a Gregorian calendar because it was named after Pope Gregory the 13th, who introduced it in 1582. So now we're going to start looking at the dates of the new moons, because knowing when the new moons are is paramount in establishing when the feast days are going to happen. So we're going to be looking at what it says scripturally and also converting it to a Gregorian calendar. So when we're looking at the new moons, we have the new moons are established by either a conjunction of the moon or the sliver moon, depending on what your belief that the new moon is. And we've talked before that a new moon determines what a new month is. So in the Gregorian calendar, in comparing it to Yahweh's calendar, we're going to be talking about mostly March or April, which starts off the beginning of months. And so that is going to be the month of Abib, or the month of Nisan, which has a Babylonian name. And then we're going to go through May and June and July and August and September and October, and that is where the feast days of Yahweh live at as far as a Gregorian calendar goes. So when we're referring to them in God's holy calendar, we're probably just going to refer to them as months in a numerical reference, like the first month, or in the month of Nisan will be the 14th day of the first month, and that will be April 18th. So we have to remember that when we are looking at the dates, we have to look at it in a biblical idea, a biblical way of looking at it, and that the days start at sunset. And so in a Gregorian calendar, we see a day as starting at either sunrise or at midnight. And so we have to adjust our thinking to think like a Hebrew and know that the day starts at sunset. So on Nisan 13 at sunset would actually turn into Nisan 14. And that would be on the Gregorian calendar. It would be sunset on the April 17th to sunset of the 18th of April. So this takes a little bit of getting used to. And so the next holy day we would look at on Yahweh's feast calendar would be the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which happens on Nisan 15. So that would be sunset of Nisan 14. And so we're talking about Nisan 15 to Nisan 22nd. And then we move on to the Feast of First Fruits, and this happens right after, pretty close to Passover, the Sunday that's after the Shabbat that's after Passover, okay? And so that Feast of First Fruits is not necessarily a day on the Hebrew calendar so much as it is as a relationship to Passover itself. So that is going to be, in 2019, it's going to be April 21st. And so that can also be called as Resurrection Sunday, as the Feast of First Fruits was fulfilled when Yeshua rose from the dead after being crucified. So then we move on to Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks, and that is going to be it's going to be the 50th day after the Feast of First Fruits. So Feast of First Fruits is on a Sunday, and Shavuot is on a Sunday. So we're going to count the Omer between the Feast of First Fruits up until Shavuot, or the Feast of Weeks. And Feast of Weeks was also fulfilled and is called Pentecost. So Pentecost Sunday and Shavuot are the same event. So that will be in the month of Sivan, which typically is either late May or early part of June. And then we have this lull in the feasts where we go about 3 or 4 months, and we wait until the month of Tishri, which is in September. And so that's why we have to know when all the beginning of months happen, because the very first fall feast depends on our interpretation of when the new moon is for Tishri, or the 7th month. So the first fall feast happens on the first day of the 7th month. So we have to know whether we believe in a moon conjuncture or a crescent moon or sliver moon. So Yom Teruah, or Rosh Hashanah, which is the 5th Moedim, the 5th holy feast of Yahweh, that happens on Tishri 1, on the 7th month, the first day of the 7th, time of Teshuvah, or repentance. And so we get our hearts right before Yahweh before we enter into the holy feast of Yom Kippur. And Yom Kippur happens on the 10th day of the 7th month. So all the fall feasts happen within the 7th month. And so we have Yom Kippur, which happens on sunset of the 9th day of Tishri and concludes on the sunset of the 10th day of Tishri. So this year, in 2019, Yom Kippur happens on October 8th. And then that takes us into the last feast of Yahweh, which is called Sukkot. And Sukkot happens 5 days after Yom Kippur on Tishri 15 and lasts till Tishri 23. In 2019, that would equate to October 13th to the 20th. And Sukkot is also going to include not only the 7 days of Sukkot, but the 8th day, the Shemini Azeret day. So we include that in Sukkot as well. So it's actually 8 days. So we have to look at when all the new moons are happening throughout the year, so we can be on track for the for not only the spring and summer feasts, but the fall feasts as well. So we need to know when the new moon is, and so we can look at when the new moons that I have listed here. We have April 5th, June 5th, May 1st, July 2nd, July 31st, August 29th, and September 29th. Those are all the days of the new moon, and those are all based upon what your belief is when a new moon is, whether it is a moon conjuncture or the sliver moon. In understanding the calendar of Yahweh, we must admit that there are 3 main moon calendar understandings, with one of them actually not using a moon in its calculation, but the sun. So the 3 calendars we have: moon conjuncture,
the silver or crescent moon, and the Enoch or solar calendar, which uses no moon. Any calendar that is used must use the new moon phase and barley Abib as the testimony of the new month. In a moon conjuncture, we can see here in the illustration that the moon phase that is called the moon conjuncture or the dark moon is actually a hidden or an invisible phase. Although we give names to certain phases, each night the change is actually gradual and very hard to see unless we have special tools at our disposal to watch the changing of the phases. So in the moon conjuncture, it is also called the dark moon phase. The new moon in the moon conjunction is when the moon is dark or in conjuncture. Conjuncture means Earth, moon, and sun are in synchronous alignment with each other. In other words, a straight line. The moon conjunction is also called the invisible phase. The new moon determines a new month by the dark phase of the moon. We look for the crescent phase of the moon's monthly cycle to determine that the first phase of the moon has already occurred. In other words, the crescent is the witness to the dark moon phase that the month has already occurred. The Arev of the new moon is the first day of the new month. Moon is calculated and witnessed, and in the beginning of months, in either March or April, we have the beginning of months, which is set by the new moon. The new moon phase of the moon conjuncture. When the moon is dark at this time of the year, at either the 12th or the 13th month, we have the beginning of months with the moon conjuncture. The 15th of the month is the full moon. So whatever reckoning you have in the moon conjuncture or the crescent moon, you can know which one it is by looking at the 15th of the month, knowing that is the full moon, and you can count back 15 days and find out when the new moon or the new month is. Sabbath is always the 7th day of the week on Saturday and is not determined by the moon, but is determined by the events of the sun. The Sabbath is based upon the sun and not the moon. In the crescent moon idea, it is a Jewish calendar keeping type of format with a Babylonian origin. The crescent or silver moon is the renewed moon phase, and the new moon is the crescent moon seen after conjunction. So they take just the opposite of the conjuncture, and they say that the crescent moon is the first phase after the moon conjunction. It is a calculated and witnessed phase of the moon and is based solely on observation. The beginning of months is the sighting of the crescent moon in the model of the crescent moon month keeping idea. The light of the moon is the new moon. The Sabbath is kept as the 7th day of the week, just as it is in a moon conjuncture format. The sun determines the years and the weekly Sabbath, and the moon determines the months and actual Moedim, or the feasts. So the way that we keep Sabbath and the annual feasts in a crescent moon is much like how we do it in a moon conjuncture type of idea, except one uses the crescent as the witness and one uses the dark moon feast keeping idea. In an Enoch calendar, it is totally different. Enoch calendar is also known as a solar based calendar. The Enoch calendar is also known as the solar calendar, so we can use those names interchangeably. The vernal equinox is the setting event for this calendar, a calendar that is founded in an apocryphal book of Enoch. Enoch is not a part of canonized scripture. They dismiss the moon as part of Yahweh's calendar and claim that the moon is not part of God's calendar. A 364-day calendar that is divided into 4 divisions of 91 days each is used. The beginning of months happens on the equinox, dismissing the barley Abib. Passover is always on a Tuesday, and unleavened bread is always on a Wednesday. Timekeeping starts on the 4th day of creation, where the sun, moon, and stars were created on this 4th day of creation week.
Another popular calendar that's out there is called the lunar Sabbath calendar. So the lunar Sabbath calendar entertains the idea that the Sabbath is based upon the moon and not the sun. So you don't see lunar Sabbatarians keeping the Sabbath day on Friday night to Saturday night, but their Sabbath is based upon the moon and not the sun cycles. The belief is that with the lunar Sabbath, they count days of the lunar month and not the Gregorian month, and identify the new moon and observes the weekly Sabbath on the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th of the lunar month. So with their type of calendar keeping, the Sabbath can be any day of the week because they are counting the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th as it relates to the beginning of the month. And with the lunar Sabbath calendar, the 8th and 30th of each month are called non-days. So they kind of forget about the 8th or the 1st and 30th of each month, and they call them non-days to be able to count for the beginning of the month and the end of the month. But in the Bible, we only see that there are only two types of days. There are work days and non-work days. And so the non-work days applies to the feast days. And with the lunar Sabbath calendar, the day is observed at sunrise and not sunset. And with the lunar Sabbath, we have some problems with it that are going to make it really hard for this calendar to work correctly. Let's take a look biblically as what it says about the Sabbath day being the seventh day. And so we know that as creation began on the first day, there's a count from the first day to the seventh day, which is the Sabbath day. So biblically, when the Sabbath is the seventh day and is doing its count from the first day and ending up on the seventh day, there is a problem with this calendar because we see in the Bible that the week and days are reckoned by the understanding of the sun determining what a day is and not the moon. The moon that was created would have been a new moon that happened on the fourth day of creation. The seventh day of Elohim resting in Scripture cannot be expressed in the lunar Sabbath belief because the moon wasn't even created into the fourth day, so you wouldn't end up on a seventh day Sabbath.